The US Air Force is the biggest and strongest in the world, that much is known, but it has some serious issues that you may not know about. This video will go in depth on two of those, both which might impact its performance in a peer-opponent war, like against China. We will cover the US Air Force pilot shortage, especially acute when it comes to fighter pilots. How might that impact the number of missions performed per day? And we'll cover the Air Force training woes. For a decade now, the Air Force training hours have been quite low, so much so that China likely overshot them in pure hours flown per year. How did that happen? How much are US and China flying per year? Watch the video to find out. Let's go straight in. The Air Force is short on pilots. For some years now, the Air Force has been several hundred pilots short. 6% of active duty Air Force pilot spots are not taken. Almost all of those are fighter pilot slots, making the problem worse. The shortage amounts to 660 active duty fighter pilots against 3,800 active duty fighter pilots. So we can see the fighter pilot shortage amounts to 15%, which is a lot. Reserve forces lack even more pilots, some 1,200, meaning 15% of overall slots are empty. Situation hasn't really improved in the last 2 years. Now, the Air Force does always have more pilots than seats on their planes. For example, it has twice as many bomber pilots than there are pilot and co-pilot seats on all US active bombers combined. And it has over 1.7 pilots for every pilot seat on tactical planes. But in a war, combat missions can be very demanding, and pilots will fly whatever plane is available in their unit. Even in peacetime, pilot names written under canopies are mostly for show. Pilots fly whatever plane they are given. Past experience in wars has proven that extensive mission planning, briefings and debriefings are key to efficient pilots. All missions in war are planned, one way or another. For a single mission, an average pilot might spend several hours in mission planning with his unit, followed by a 2-hour briefing. Then up to an hour of flight prep, taxiing around the runway and so on, followed by whatever flight time the actual mission requires. Finally, an hour for post-flight paperwork and review of in-air camera footage, and again an hour or two to debrief. Some missions will be short, just half an hour of flight time if it's an interception. Those won't be planned as much. But especially in the Pacific against China, some missions may involve great distances, in-flight refueling and possibly several hours in the cockpit. If long time on station is required, even 7 to 8 hour missions would not be rare. So anywhere from 12 to 15 hours of prep, flight and debrief per day might be the norm in the Pacific. Long missions sitting for hours in a cramped cockpit are notoriously taxing on the body. Long story short, there might often be situations where a plane does a mission and is ready even the same day, but the pilot is not ready. 10 or 15% fewer sorties per day might not be trivial. In a large war, for 1,000 planes available on paper, that might mean up to 150 fighter jets not actually doing missions. That's why insufficient pilot numbers might be an issue. A sad issue is hard for the Air Force to remedy. It downsized the force after the Cold War, losing many instructors. Now it doesn't have the capacity to train enough new pilots at once, and existing pilots often switch jobs earlier than before, choosing more lucrative commercial airliner pilot jobs. The fact that there is not enough money to fly combat jets as often as before is also an issue, and eager new pilots may get disillusioned when they see how little they actually fly per year during peacetime. In wartime, some of those pilot debriefs might be compressed, and other pilot-qualified personnel might be reinstated as actual pilots to cover part of the shortage, but it's still an issue. However, here's the really ugly part: pilot training. That has for the longest time since World War II been a strong point for the US Air Force. During the Cold War, US pilots were famously getting over 200 hours of flight time per year, while Soviet pilots were managing 120. More training usually means greater proficiency at most tasks, but it can also mean that certain tasks require their own training. For example, Soviets had very few in-flight refueling planes. and thus very few Soviet pilots trained for that. US pilots relied on such refueling, so part of their 200-plus annual hours was spent training for said activity. Effectively, that could mean fewer hours trained for the same stuff that the Soviets trained for. Similarly, Soviet pilots were often trained for either air combat or ground combat. Many US pilots received training for both, again possibly leveling the field a bit. Of course, having multi-role planes and multi-role pilots effectively means more planes for any given task, so it is desirable to multitask and multi-role. Anyway, come the early 2010s, the US DoD was strapped for cash, and the Air Force decided it was wise to fly less, and somehow that mostly stuck even to today. The monthly flight figures per pilot have fallen to abysmal levels from their Cold War era highs. Figures come from the Air Force's Almanac publication. Sadly for 2023, the Air Force chose not to disclose their figures. Hopefully they've got nothing to hide. Issue with data used is that it uses two different measurement systems. In the early 2010s, it shows all tactical aircraft together, which may include planes other than fighters. Data from 2018 onward is more precise. Anecdotally, however, there were reports of old F-15 and F-16 pilots hitting milestones years ago. So 15 years ago, it does seem as if fighter pilots were more easily hitting 130 and sometimes even 170 hours per year. Even that is a far cry from the Cold War era 200 hours per year. Fast forward to a few years ago and it's evident those figures fell to fewer than 100 hours for the average active duty Air Force fighter pilot, with reserve pilots like Air National Guard ones faring even a bit worse. It was only in 2022 that some visible rise in training hours happened, but even that is far from figures needed to be proficient at a multitude of tasks. It has to be said, of course, that simulators have helped a great deal in the last decade or two. 10 years ago, a third of all training was done in simulators. Today that is likely to be even higher. But still, given that we see an attempt to increase actual flight hours, it is apparent the Air Force also sees those sub-100-hour figures as inadequate. That has been happening for some years now, so there may be a whole generation of pilots which never really trained enough. All that is compounded with more and more pilots leaving for more profitable jobs, right after their 10-year stint in the Air Force ends. Overall, average competency of an Air Force fighter pilot today is likely somewhat worse than 10 or 15 years ago. Advanced technology can help compensate for that, but only to a degree. To put all that in context, how do those figures compare with Chinese ones? Only sporadic claims of training hours exist, and not all are equally reputable, but some semblance of a trend can be surmised. In 1995, a RAND think tank paper claimed China's fighter pilots flew 100 to 110 hours per year. That was basically just half the US figures back then. In 2007, US DoD press service report claimed Chinese fighter pilots flew 120 hours a year. That was already closer to US figures, as by 2007 not many pilots were hitting 170 hours, judging by those rare milestones. And National Guard pilots were already doing under 100 hours back then. Military Balance 2018 publication said that in 2017 China's bomber, attack and fighter pilots averaged from 100 to 150 hours per year. Using US ratios per type, its plausible fighter pilots were near the upper range of that spectrum. Back in 2012, Air Force magazine actually suggested up to 200 hours of flight time for China, but let's leave that out as a suspect outlier. 2022 saw ex-US officer John Venable say Chinese fighter pilots are doing 150 hours per year, based on anecdotal reports. There were instances in Chinese media where a certain flanker pilot would hit, say, 1700-hour milestone in 10 years, but it's possible such figures aren't the norm or the average. During that 2017 to 2022 timeframe, active-duty US Air Force pilots were doing 100 to 130 hours, or 25% less. National Guard pilots were basically flying 100 hours per year, over a third less. All that of course assumes Chinese estimates are true, But given the surge in Chinese military spending and uptick in their flight activity, their frequent exercises near Taiwan, it does seem plausible China fighter pilots do train more than US Air Force fighter pilots, and that may have been the case for several years now. More, of course, doesn't have to mean that the training itself is of the same quality. US Air Force aircraft being on average quite old, which we talked about in a previous video, also doesn't help. Old planes are less available, and with less planes available, less training can be done. With money being prioritized for other things like developing new technology systems to trump the Chinese, training may be taking a back seat. Overall, the US still plausibly holds some pilot training advantage over China. For the longest time, China's Air Force training was very formal and rote. It took roughly twice as long as US pilot training, with all the officer training included for both sides. China safeguarded their trainees and avoided risk in training. That was the way for decades. The demanding training was in a way informally occurring only for active duty pilots once they reached their frontline unit. Only after 2017, after some reforms came into place, did Chinese pilot training become more like the US one, taking more risks, allowing trainees to do higher G maneuvers, to experience spins, and so on. So China's Air Force has produced only several years of pilots trained under reasonably realistic conditions so far, even if those pilots do fly a lot once they get to their frontline units. The US Air Force still holds some edge when it comes to training quality, and if the flight hours increase soon, the issue that besets it could be partially mitigated. Just how much the training deficiency of the past and of today will bite the US Air Force in the future, that's impossible to say, but it's not a good situation to be in. And remember, Binkov may talk about war, but only real peace can bring us all together.